I wasn't supposed to hear it. I had gone over to my parents' house to drop off some mortgage paperwork, just a quick errand before heading back home, nothing special. I didn't even plan to stay, just hand over the documents, maybe endure a few passive-aggressive comments about how I never visit, and be on my way. But as I stepped through the front door, voices from the kitchen stopped me in my tracks. "She doesn't need to know," my mother's voice cut through the air, sharp, impatient. My father sighed. "It's going to come out eventually." I wasn't sure what they were talking about, but something in his voice, the weight of it, the hesitation, made my stomach twist. "She'll find out after we're gone," my mother continued, her tone clipped, certain. "And by then, it won't matter. Jason is the one who's going to need it. He's starting a family. She's fine on her own." My mouth went dry. "Cutting her out completely," my father muttered. "It feels wrong." My pulse pounded in my ears, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it almost hurt. I felt something cold settle in my bones. Cutting her out. She doesn't need to know. Jason is the one who's going to need it. They were talking about me. I stepped forward, my shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floor, but it was enough. My mother turned first, her body tensing as soon as she saw me, her expression stiffening like she had just been caught red-handed. My father followed, slower, his lips pressing into a thin line. They looked guilty. I felt my voice before I heard it, low and shaky. "You rewrote the will." Silence. A long, suffocating silence that told me everything before either of them could even speak. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My father looked away, rubbing his forehead like this was some exhausting inconvenience instead of a knife between my ribs. "So it's true," I said, barely above a whisper, but the betrayal in my voice filled the entire room. "Lizzie, sit down," my mom finally said, her voice shifting into that condescending softness she always used when she wanted to make something ugly sound reasonable. I stayed standing. "You weren't even going to tell me." "It's not like that," my father said, but there was no conviction behind it. I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Then what is it like? Because from where I'm standing, it sure as hell sounds like you decided I don't count anymore." My mother straightened her shoulders, like she was reminding herself that she was still in control of this situation. "Lizzie, we had to make a choice." Jason, I spat, and of course this was about him. My younger brother, the golden boy who never worked for anything, who made mistake after mistake and still got handed everything on a silver platter. "He's starting a family," she said, like that explained everything, like that justified erasing me. "And what about me?" My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "What am I?" "Just nothing." My father sighed, tired of the conversation already. "You've always been independent. You don't need us the way he does." I stared at them, at these two people I thought I knew, and felt something in me snap. "Got it," I said, my voice eerily steady now, my hands shaking at my sides. "I see exactly where I stand." My mother stepped forward, reaching out like she could undo what had just happened. "Lizzie, don't be dramatic." I flinched away from her touch like it burned. "Dramatic?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just something hollow and sharp. "You think I'm being dramatic? You rewrote your will behind my back, erased me from it like I was never your daughter, and you weren't even going to tell me. How the hell am I supposed to react to that?" "It's not personal," my father muttered, as if that would somehow make this better. I blinked at him. "Not personal?" My entire existence had been reduced to an afterthought, and he thought I wouldn't take it personally? "So you're saying if I died tomorrow, it wouldn't make a difference to you? Because from where I'm standing, it sure seems like you already made peace with cutting me out of your life." My mother exhaled sharply, irritated now, her mask of concern slipping. "This is exactly why we didn't want to tell you," she muttered. "You're acting like we did this to hurt you." "You did hurt me," I snapped, the words coming out too fast, too raw. "You made a decision about my life, about our family, without even giving me the courtesy of a conversation. That's not love, Mom. That's betrayal." She rolled her eyes. Actually rolled her eyes at me, like I was just some annoying child throwing a tantrum. "Lizzie, you don't understand." "No," I cut her off, my voice razor sharp. "I do understand. You've made it perfectly clear. Jason gets everything. Jason is the real priority. And me? I get nothing. Because I don't need you. Because I'm not worth it. Stop twisting our words, my father muttered, rubbing his temples like this conversation was giving him a migraine. I stared at him, at both of them, at the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, who had taught me my whole life to work hard, to stand on my own, to be responsible, only to use all of that as an excuse to justify throwing me away. I felt something inside me break. Not just anger. Not just hurt. Something final. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself to swallow down the lump in my throat, the tears threatening to spill over. I want my name removed from the will completely. My voice was steady now, deliberate, controlled. I don't want anything from you. Not now, not ever. My mother's eyes widened. Lizzie, don't be ridiculous. I mean it, I said. Don't just cut me out of the inheritance, cut me out of everything. From now on, I'm not your daughter. You don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to erase me when it's convenient and still expect me to show up for Thanksgiving and pretend like we're still a family. My father's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it, suddenly looking pale, like she hadn't actually considered what it would mean to lose me completely. I stepped back, one foot out the door already. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. And then I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me so hard the walls rattled. I didn't look back. I never would again. I didn't go home after I left. There was no way I could sit in my apartment, staring at the walls, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me like something permanent. I needed air, I needed movement, I needed anything but the crushing weight of knowing my own parents had decided I wasn't worth considering. I drove without thinking, taking random turns, letting the city swallow me up in its noise and motion until I somehow ended up in front of my best friend's house. I wasn't sure if I had even intended to come here or if my subconscious had just guided me to the one place where I might be able to say it out loud without feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. The second I knocked, the door swung open, and Claire stood there with a confused look that shifted into concern the moment she saw my face. She didn't ask any questions, didn't hesitate, just stepped aside and let me in before closing the door behind me. I barely made it to her couch before everything I had been holding back on the drive over came crashing down all at once. My whole body felt like it was vibrating, like my skin couldn't contain everything that was boiling underneath. Claire sat next to me, waiting, not pushing, just there, which somehow made it worse because I knew the second I started talking, I wouldn't be able to stop. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice, but the second I spoke, it cracked anyway. They cut me out of the will. Claire blinked, not understanding at first, but as the words settled, her eyes widened, her expression twisting into something sharp. What? I exhaled shakily, running a hand through my hair, trying to keep my hands from shaking. They rewrote everything. Gave it all to Jason. Didn't even plan on telling me. I only found out because I walked in on them talking about it. Claire's mouth opened and closed like she couldn't quite decide where to start, like there were too many things to be outraged about at once. Wait, hold on. What the hell? They actually just, erased you? I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. Pretty much. Apparently, Jason needs it more than I do. Because he's starting a family. Because I don't need them. Claire's face darkened in a way I had only seen a handful of times before, that sharp, furious kind of anger that only came out when she was barely holding back from doing something reckless. That's such bullshit. That's, Jesus, Liz, I don't even know what to say. Who does that to their own kid? I inhaled sharply, pressing my palms against my knees, trying to keep the anger from turning into something desperate. Them, apparently. And the worst part is, they didn't even think it was a big deal. They just stood there acting like I was the one being unreasonable. Like I was supposed to be okay with it. Claire's hands curled into fists, her whole body tense like she was getting ready to march over there and start yelling in my place. I swear to God, if I see your mom, I'm going to lose it. You've done everything for them. You never ask for anything, you've always been the responsible one, and this is what they do? Just throw you away like you don't matter. I shook my head, exhaling through my nose, forcing my voice to stay level. I told them to take me out completely. Not just the will. Everything. I don't want anything to do with them. Claire's expression faltered, something shifting behind her eyes, something close to worry. Liz. I get it, I do, but are you sure? I mean, I wouldn't blame you if you never wanted to speak to them again, but that's huge. That's permanent. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to waver. It already is permanent, Claire. They made that choice the second they decided I didn't count. I'm just making it official. She studied me for a long moment, then sighed, leaning back against the couch. I still think you should at least give yourself some time to think before you burn the bridge completely. Not for them, but for you. You don't have to decide everything right this second. I looked away, focusing on the floor, the weight of it all pressing down on me so heavily that I almost couldn't breathe. There's nothing to think about. Claire didn't argue, just nodded, her jaw still tight with frustration. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're making the right call. If they don't want to treat you like family, then they don't deserve to have you in their lives. Something in my chest twisted painfully, because hearing her say it out loud made it feel real in a way that even the confrontation with my parents hadn't. I didn't stay much longer after that. I felt restless, like I needed to move, like if I sat still too long, everything would sink in too deeply and I wouldn't be able to breathe under the weight of it. Claire hugged me tightly before I left, gripping me hard like she was trying to hold me together through sheer force of will, and for a second, I almost let myself break down right there. But I didn't. I just swallowed it all down and drove home, my hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. I barely made it through the door before my phone rang, my mother's name flashing across the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether I even wanted to answer, but something told me she wasn't calling to apologize. I pressed accept, lifting the phone to my ear without saying anything. Lizzie, we need to talk. I exhaled through my nose, keeping my voice steady. We already did. My mother sighed heavily, like I was the one being difficult. You need to stop overreacting. You're making this into something it's not. I closed my eyes briefly, pinching the bridge of my nose. I'm not overreacting. You just don't like that I'm not rolling over and accepting it. You're acting like we don't love you. Because you don't. The words came out before I could stop them, before I could soften them into something easier to hear. Not the way you love Jason. Not the way you should. There was silence on the other end of the line, long and heavy. Then my mother exhaled sharply, something in her tone shifting into something colder, sharper. Fine. If that's how you feel, then maybe it's for the best. I didn't say anything. I just hung up. I turned my phone off after that, staring at the dark screen for a long moment before setting it down. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing in from all sides, but I refused to let it break me. I had made my choice, and now there was no going back. I thought cutting them off would bring some kind of relief, but instead, it left this strange, hollow feeling sitting in my chest like something unfinished. I kept waiting for it to hit me all at once, for the weight of what I had done to knock the air out of me, but it didn't, at least not in the way I expected. Instead, it crept in slowly, in quiet moments, in the stillness of my apartment when there was nothing left to distract me, in the way my phone stayed silent when I knew that if this had been a normal week, my mother would have texted about something trivial, reminding me about some distant cousin's birthday or sending a passive-aggressive comment about how she knew I had to be too busy to call. I had spent my whole life being the reliable one, the responsible one, the daughter who never needed anything from them, but now that I was truly alone, now that I had removed myself from their lives as neatly as they had removed me from their will, I found myself wondering if they even cared that I was gone or if they had already moved on, perfectly fine with the version of their family that no longer included me. I kept myself busy, went to work, focused on deadlines, filled my evenings with anything that kept my mind from circling back to the same place over and over again. Claire checked in on me more than usual, dragging me out for drinks or calling just to talk about nothing, which I appreciated even if I didn't always have the energy to engage. I could tell she wanted me to open up more, to vent or cry or do something that made it look like I was actually dealing with it, but I didn't have the words, and even if I did, I wasn't sure saying them out loud would help. I told myself I was fine, that I had done the right thing, that my parents had made their choice and I had made mine, and there was nothing left to say. Then Jason called. I almost let it go to voicemail, staring at his name flashing on my screen, debating whether or not I even wanted to hear his voice. He had been silent throughout everything, not a single message, no attempt to reach out, no acknowledgement of what had happened. I had spent weeks wondering whether he had even known about it before I found out, or if our parents had only told him after the fact, maybe framing it as some noble sacrifice on his part rather than what it really was. I had convinced myself that I didn't care, that I had no interest in whatever excuses he might try to offer, but in that moment, I realized some small part of me was still waiting, still holding out for something, even if I didn't know what. I answered, keeping my voice even. What do you want? Jason let out a breath like he had been expecting me to be more hostile. I figured you'd ignore me. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the edge harder than necessary. You didn't exactly give me a reason to answer. There was a pause on his end, just long enough to make it clear he wasn't sure how to start. Look, Mom told me what happened. I let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. Oh, so she did tell you. When? Before or after they decided I wasn't worth keeping around? Another pause, this one heavier. After. I didn't know until she called me freaking out about you cutting them off completely. Right, I said, pressing my fingers against my temple. So she wasn't worried about what they did, just that I wasn't rolling over and accepting it. Jason sighed, and I could already tell this conversation was going exactly the way I had expected. I get why you're pissed, Liz. I do. But you know how they are. Mom convinced herself this was the right thing, and once she makes up her mind, there's no talking her out of it. I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tighter. That's not an excuse. I'm not saying it is, he said quickly. I'm just saying they didn't do this to hurt you. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. They didn't have to mean to hurt me. They still did. Jason was silent for a moment, like he didn't have an argument for that, which was a rare thing for him. I didn't ask for this, you know. I closed my eyes briefly. I never said you did. I don't want to take everything from you. But you're still going to. Another silence, longer this time, and I could picture him sitting wherever he was, running a hand through his hair, struggling to find a way to justify it without actually saying the words. What do you want me to do? I let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over my face. You really want me to answer that? Jason hesitated, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice when he finally spoke. You know I can't just turn it down, Liz. I let that sit between us, that awful, inevitable truth that had always been there, that I had known from the second I realized what our parents had done. Jason had been handed everything his whole life, always given an easy way out, always bailed out of whatever mess he got himself into, and now he had been handed my share of our parents' future as well. I had spent years resenting how easy things were for him, how little he had to try, how nothing ever really touched him, but I had never expected him to care, not really. Jason wasn't cruel, not in the way our parents were, but he had never been the kind of person to push back when something benefited him, even if it came at someone else's expense. You could turn it down, I said finally, my voice quieter now, tired. You just won't. Jason didn't argue, didn't offer some half-hearted attempt at denying it, because we both knew it was true. I didn't want things to end up like this, he said after a long pause. Neither did I. Another beat of silence. Are you really done with them? I stared at the floor, my chest tight, the answer already there before I even had to think about it. Yeah. Jason exhaled slowly, and there was something in the way he did it that made me think he had been expecting it, but still didn't quite know what to do with it. All right. I nodded to myself, gripping the phone a little harder. Yeah. Jason didn't say anything else after that, and neither did I. The conversation was over, even if neither of us had actually ended the call yet. Eventually, he sighed again, mumbled something that sounded like "take care of yourself," and hung up, leaving me standing in my kitchen, staring at the dark screen of my phone, feeling like whatever small part of me had been waiting for something had just finally given up. I turned my phone off again and put it away. There was nothing left to wait for. It wasn't over, no matter how much I wanted it to be. I had made my decision, cut them out, ended the conversation, and told myself that there was nothing left to say, but somehow, they still found a way to pull me back in. I had been waiting for it, expecting it, knowing my mother wouldn't be able to just leave things as they were, but even then, I wasn't prepared for how quickly she would shift from denial to outright manipulation. It started with a message from my father, a short, stiff invitation to meet for dinner at their house to discuss things properly. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether or not to even respond, knowing exactly what this was, knowing that it wouldn't be some heartfelt conversation where they admitted they had been wrong and tried to fix it. They had already made it clear where they stood, and I had accepted that, so what was the point? I ignored the message, deleted it, and went on with my day, but then my mother called, and when I didn't answer, she called again and again, until finally, I picked up just to stop the relentless ringing that was making my head pound. "Lizzie, you need to stop this," she said the second I answered, her voice sharp in that way that told me she had already decided I was being irrational. I didn't bother pretending to misunderstand. "Stop what?" "This attitude," she said, like I was some teenager throwing a fit instead of an adult who had made a choice based on the way they had treated me. "Your father and I are trying to fix this, but you won't even give us the chance." I let out a slow breath, pressing my fingers against my forehead. "There's nothing to fix. You made your decision, and I made mine." She sighed, the kind of sigh that was meant to make me feel guilty. "I don't understand why you're making this so dramatic. You're acting like we've disowned you." I blinked, stunned by how easily she said it, how quickly she twisted everything around to make it sound like I was the one being unreasonable. "You did disown me. You just did it quietly, on paper, behind my back, and hoped I wouldn't find out until it was too late." "That is not what happened," she snapped, her patience slipping just enough for me to hear the frustration in her voice. "Jason needed more help than you. It was a practical decision." I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly, forcing myself to stay calm, even though everything inside me wanted to scream at her for how casually she was trying to justify what they had done. "And you didn't think that was something you should have told me? You didn't think I deserved to at least know?" "It wouldn't have changed anything," she said, and the sheer bluntness of it nearly knocked the breath out of me. "You would have been upset no matter what." I opened my mouth, then shut it again, because I didn't even know what to say to that. There was no reasoning with someone who had already decided they were right. She must have mistaken my silence for hesitation because her tone shifted, softening just enough to sound like she was being reasonable. "We want to have dinner, just to talk. No arguing, no drama, just a conversation. Can you at least do that?" I stared at the floor, gripping the phone tighter, feeling that awful pull of obligation settle in my stomach. I wanted to tell her no, that there was nothing left to discuss, that they had already said everything they needed to say when they cut me out of their lives, but I knew my mother. If I didn't agree to this, she would keep pushing, keep calling, keep finding ways to drag this out until I either gave in or let the whole thing consume me. "Fine," I said finally, my voice flat. "One dinner." She exhaled in relief, as if she had won something. "Good. Tomorrow night at 7. I hung up without saying anything else. The next evening, I drove to their house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't know why I was doing this, why I was giving them another opportunity to try and make me feel like I was the one who had overreacted. Maybe a small part of me still wanted to hear some kind of explanation that made sense, something that would at least make it easier to accept. Maybe I just wanted to see if they even had it in them to admit they had hurt me. Either way, I found myself pulling into their driveway, walking up to the front door like I hadn't already made the choice to leave them behind. The second I stepped inside, I knew I had made a mistake. The air was too heavy, the forced warmth in my mother's smile too practiced, the way my father barely looked at me making it clear that this wasn't an apology, just a performance. The table was already set, the kind of meal my mother always made when she wanted everything to feel normal, but I wasn't going to pretend. "Why am I here?" I asked, not even bothering to sit down. My mother's smile faltered for half a second before she recovered. "To have dinner. To talk." I glanced at my father, who was still avoiding my eyes, his mouth pressed into that familiar, thin line of quiet disapproval. So talk. She sighed, setting down her napkin, like I was the one being difficult. Lizzie, we don't want this to be the way things are. Family is important. I folded my arms, waiting. That's funny, considering you made it pretty clear that I wasn't important enough to include in yours. That's not fair, my father muttered, finally speaking, his voice low and tired. I let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. Fair? Fair would have been telling me the truth instead of letting me find out by accident. Fair would have been at least pretending like you cared about what this would do to me. My mother's lips pressed together, and for the first time, I saw something flicker across her face that almost looked like regret. But it wasn't enough. You don't understand, Lizzie, she said, and I knew she was about to launch into some speech about how I was taking this too personally, how they had done what they thought was best, how I needed to stop making it a bigger deal than it was. I had heard it all before, and I wasn't going to stand there and listen to it again. I stepped back, shaking my head. I shouldn't have come. My father sighed again, rubbing his forehead like I was exhausting him. Liz, don't be like this. I laughed, shaking my head. Be like what? Angry? Hurt? Done. My mother reached out, but I moved before she could touch me. Lizzie, please, let's just sit and eat. No, I said, turning toward the door. I'm not doing this again. I walked out without looking back, stepping into the cold night air, feeling more certain than ever that I had made the right choice. I wasn't coming back. I thought that walking out of that dinner would be the end of it, that I would finally get to move on without my parents' voices echoing in the back of my mind, but I should have known better. They had spent my entire life believing they had the final say in everything, that their choices were law, that no matter how angry or hurt I was, I would always come back in the end. Maybe that had been true before, when I still believed I could do enough to make them see me, to make them value me in the same way they valued Jason, but now I saw things for what they really were. I didn't belong in their version of family, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I had never been their priority in the first place. There was no fixing that, no finding common ground when they had already made it clear that my worth had been measured and deemed unnecessary. I told myself that was enough, that I had all the closure I was going to get, and that I wouldn't waste any more energy on something that was never going to change. But just when I thought I could finally let it go, Jason showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer when I saw him through the peephole, but I knew if I didn't let him in, he would just keep coming back until I did. I opened the door, stepping aside without a word as he walked in, looking around like he had never really paid attention to where I lived before. He had always been like that, moving through life with the confidence of someone who never had to worry about losing anything, and for a second, I wondered if he even realized what it had cost me for him to end up with everything. He turned to face me, hands shoved into his pockets, that same uneasy expression from our last phone call still on his face. I just came from Mom and Dad's, he said, watching me carefully like he was waiting to see how I would react. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. And? He let out a slow breath, shifting his weight. They're upset. I let out a short laugh that didn't sound like amusement at all. Good. Jason frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. Liz, I know you're pissed, but this whole thing has gotten out of control. You really want to just never speak to them again. I stared at him, waiting to see if there was more, if he was going to say something that actually mattered, something that would make this conversation worth having, but when he just looked at me expectantly like I was supposed to feel guilty, I shook my head. Yeah, I do. He exhaled sharply, dropping his hands to his sides. Come on, they're still Mom and Dad. I straightened, pushing off the counter, feeling the familiar heat of frustration settle in my chest. No, Jason, they're your Mom and Dad. I was just an obligation they didn't know what to do with. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, and for the first time, I wondered if some part of him actually understood, if maybe he had known all along but had never been willing to say it out loud. He shook his head, looking away for a moment before meeting my eyes again. They asked me to talk to you. They want you to come over and work things out. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe through the sharp rush of anger that flared at his words. They don't want to work things out, Jason. They want me to pretend none of this happened so they don't have to feel bad about it. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair like he was already tired of this conversation. Liz, what do you want from them? An apology? For them to rewrite the will and split everything 50-50? I narrowed my eyes. I don't want anything from them. That's the whole point. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Right. So you'd rather just cut them out and act like they don't exist. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to not let him drag me into another argument that would go nowhere. I didn't make that choice, Jason. They did. They decided I wasn't part of their future. I'm just making sure they know I got the message. Jason was quiet for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, the way he was trying to piece together some way to make this work, to smooth things over like he always did. It was what he had been taught, that no matter what, things would always be adjusted in his favor, that if there was a problem, someone else would fix it before it actually affected him. Finally, he exhaled, rubbing his face. Mom's gonna be heartbroken if you go through with this. I tilted my head, studying him. So, Jason blinked, clearly not expecting that answer, and I watched as the realization hit him all at once, the understanding that I truly, honestly did not care anymore. He had spent our whole lives watching me hold everything together, being the one who always made the effort, always showed up, always did the work to keep the family from falling apart, and now, for the first time, I wasn't playing that role. I wasn't making it easy. I wasn't letting them off the hook. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head again. You're really done. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into something solid inside me. Yeah. Jason didn't argue, didn't try to push anymore, just stood there for a few seconds before giving me a small nod. All right. I watched as he turned to leave, and just as he reached the door, he hesitated. For what it's worth, I didn't ask for any of this. I swallowed, my voice even when I spoke. I know. He nodded again, then walked out, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I realized that was the real ending, the final piece of this whole mess settling into place. My parents could tell themselves whatever they wanted, could spin their version of events into whatever made them feel better, but it didn't change anything. I had finally done what they never thought I would. I had stopped waiting for them to love me the way I deserved. I had chosen myself. And for the first time, that was enough. Some people will never see your worth, no matter how much you prove yourself to them. The hardest lesson in life is realizing that you don't need their validation, you only need your own.